afternoon of 25th May 2017. It's Africa Liberation Day. We're not out celebrating, but I'm honored to be in the presence of Dr. Tony Browder, who is an important African-American scholar, and I have some questions to ask him.
Sure.
I've been listening to him earlier in the day, and I know that his answers are revealing and insightful, so I'm looking forward to this session. Let me confess at the outset that I'm actually kind of new, shamefully, to your work, and I have to say that what encouraged me to it was the fact that Dr. John Henry Clark has praises for it. And I say that anybody who Dr. Clark recommends is doing something worthy. So thank you for allowing me to interview you. In checking you out, as it were, I know that it's reported in one of your books, or on the back of one of your books, that you had a moment of something like revelation in Egypt some years ago, when you set yourself on the path that you're now on. And it seems to me to be an important part of knowledge production and dissemination. So before that moment, can you just tell us something briefly about what constituted you, what made you up until that moment? I know that you're from Chicago, but just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, from Chicago, born to a teenage mother. Mother was 16 when I was born, still living with her parents. Never met my biological father, and was educated in elementary school and high school in Chicago, and left Chicago in 1971 to come to Washington, D.C. to attend Howard University. Graduated from Howard in 1974, and did not begin my real education, cultural education, until February 21st, 1977. That is when I met Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, who had just published They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in America. And meeting Dr. Van Sertima, listening to his talk, made me aware of the fact that I had been miseducated all of my life. One of the most revealing statements that Van Sertima shared at that initial meeting with him, book signing and lecture with him, was that the ancient Egyptians were black.
Yes.
And everything that I've read, everything that I've been taught prior to 1977 reinforced the lie that the Egyptians were white.
Yes.
So here is a man who's telling me that the ancient Egyptians were black and that some of them traveled to the Americas 2,500 years before Christopher Columbus. So this was a revelation that blew my mind.
Yes.
And upon reading Van Sertima's work and being introduced now to the works of Dr. Ben, Yosef Ben, John Jackson, and John Henry Clark, I became aware of the fact that there was another level of knowledge that I had never been formally introduced to. I began to immerse myself into that history, that real history. And that immersion culminated in making my first trip to Egypt with Dr. Ben in December of 1980. And I will be making my 55th trip to Egypt in August of this year.
Congratulations. I still haven't made it even once.
All right, well, you gotta go, man. It's a journey of a lifetime. But no, I learned firsthand that I've been lied to. Lied to by people who knew me, people who loved me, and people who didn't know any better. Could not distinguish between alternative facts and accurate facts. So once I was aware of that reality, I then assumed the responsibility for re-educating myself and then sharing what I was learning with others so that they would not have to go through the process of re-education that I did.
Yeah. And apart from the very important truth that the ancient Egyptians, the ordinary people, the gods and the rulers were black people, what would you say was the most important thing about the ancient Egyptian that us Africans should know?
Well, I mean, just the mere fact that they were African, the mere fact that the oldest documented civilization known to mankind is an African civilization, that African architects and engineers designed and constructed buildings that cannot be replicated today, that African physicians were responsible for developing medical techniques that are still used today, that yes, Africans were kings and queens, but I would say 99.9% of the general population of Africa were not kings and queens. They were scientists and thinkers and workers and builders and farmers and mothers and fathers and healers.
Yes.
And that they have incredible lessons to teach us. And if we know that they have lessons to teach us, and if we're willing to learn those lessons today.
Okay. Now, ancient Egypt lasted an incredibly long time, but did in fact fall at various times under the influence and power of others. And one of the most important of those others was the Greeks. What would you say was the most important impact of the Greeks on ancient Egypt, and the loss to us that has in a way began the start of?
Well, you know, one of the things that Dr. Clark talked about was that when the 25th dynasty fell and Kemet was ruled by the Assyrians, very brutal foreigners, he often referenced the fact that they prayed for a deliverer. And that deliverer came in the person of Alexander in Macedonia. So the Greeks came in, defeated the Assyrians, and then assumed responsibility for the cultural heritage of Kemet. So to put some things in perspective, looking at that aspect of African history from a contemporary standpoint, many people often assume that the Greeks came in as robbers and thieves and appropriated everything that was in Kemet. I don't really think that that's a accurate statement. The Greeks came in, prior to the Greeks coming in as invaders, they came in as students. And they learned at the feet of African mathematicians and scientists and physicians, thinkers and builders. And when the early Greeks went back home to share this new knowledge with their fellow countrymen, they were condemned, they were ostracized for introducing new gods and new concepts of buildings. Even, well, encouraged to commit suicide.
Quite so.
But in any instance, people who are struggling for their existence will look to other lands as opportunities for growth and development. And the Greeks certainly look to Egypt as an opportunity for growth and development, just as foreigners from around the world look to America as an opportunity for growth and development. So they came in as conquerors, conquering other foreigners who were there, drove out those foreigners, and then the Greeks under Ptolemy literally married into the African royal families so that their children would be considered legitimate heirs to the throne. So it was cultural appropriation, and also it was a matter of them taking on aspects of the society that they knew was better than theirs.
I have few difficulties with that. There is one thing that the Greeks did, in my view, that I'd like you to comment on, which is that prior to their coming, Egyptian knowledge, as written down, was stored in temple libraries. And the Greeks collected it up and put it, some people say 500,000, some say 700,000 papyri in this famous Alexandrian library. And my belief is that that was the start of the endangerment of that collection of learning, of which we have now just fragments, even though there is quite a lot. It's still fragments of what there was. And that act of collecting up menaced Egyptian written culture in a way that it would not otherwise have been had that act of collecting has, insisted
Right.
of bringing it together so that it be burned, which it was shortly after on 2 occasions and then 3 and 4 occasions, strikes me as one of the more important events in Kemetic history.
Well, I don't disagree with that. But the other contributing factor to the downfall of knowledge in Kemet was the advent of Christianity. And what the Christian rulers, particularly during the Roman domination of Egypt, the Christian rulers saw Kemetic knowledge as a threat.
Yes.
And they were the ones who were primarily responsible for the burning of the libraries and the closing of the temples. It was Theodosius who first ordered the closing of all the temples. It was Justinian in the 5th century AD who succeeded in closing the last temple of Kemet and failed. It was the closing of that temple. Because the other thing, to speak to your point, even though Ptolemy had issued requests, demands for knowledge to be collected at the library in Alexandria, it didn't mean that the other libraries were closed. They made copies. They made copies of all of these texts. And what Ptolemy did was he put the original in his library, and they kept the copies in the other temples. So that information was still there. It was not erased from history. It was only when Justinian succeeded in closing the last temple was the library closed for good, and more importantly, the ability to read Metanetra and decipher not just what was written on the papyrus scrolls in the libraries, but also to read what was on the temples. That ability was lost for about 1,300 years until Champollion deciphered Metanetra. So, we're not going to get into a thing as to which white men were good, which white men were bad.
It's not one of my issues.
But the issue is, they saw something of value, and they took it.
Yes.
And that valuable knowledge.
It's one of the talents that we use.
Well, they're excellent thieves. They're the best thieves in the world.
Yes.
And that knowledge lifted them out of a barbaric state. And that when Rome fell, then the ability of this information to continue to flow into Europe ceased. And it was part of that cessation of African knowledge in Europe that led to the Dark Ages. And it was only when that information began to resurface in Europe that you have the Age of Enlightenment, the Renaissance. So we know that Africa was the light of the world, still is the light of the world.
We'll take that very important fact that Africa is the light of the world. You're doing, and this is remarkable, original research, archaeological Egyptology in Egypt at the moment.
Right.
Could you just tell us, and you mentioned earlier, original and important discoveries in the last year or so made by you. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. And let me just correct something that you stated at the beginning of this interview. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a PhD.
No.
And the reason I make that statement is that I think that's one of my benefits, that I was not formally trained. I don't have a specific indoctrination. I'm not a part of an institution, so that my career is not on the line. I am a free agent, source, if you will. And so I have pursued things that interest me, and I've been responsible for financing those pursuits. So in 2008, I was in Egypt, and I was introduced to a woman, Dr. Lena Pristikova, who had discovered these 2 23rd dynasty tombs, and was given a personal tour of these tombs by Dr. Pristikova. And as a result of my relationship with Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, A.C. Hilliard, John Jackson, and others, I knew where I was, and I knew the benefit of what she had discovered. And when she shared with me that she was unable to get financing for this excavation simply because she was excavating Kushite tombs, African tombs in Egypt. And she had exhausted her funds and was about to shut the project down. I knew that this discovery was too important to allow to slip through our hands. And I made a commitment to fund the excavation of that project. That's how I got involved in the project. And so as a result of us putting our money where our mouth was, it gave us an opportunity now to invest in this excavation and then to bring people over on a regular basis to participate in this archaeological excavation. So I'm not an Egyptologist, I'm not an archaeologist, but I know more about Egypt.
But not formally, academically.
But I know more about Egypt than the average Egyptologist.
Absolutely.
And I have been involved in excavations, archaeological excavations, than most Egyptologists have been, and we made some phenomenal discoveries. So what that reinforces within my mind is that there are various ways to access truth, knowledge, and that I've chosen a path which has been the right path for me. And as a result of that choice, I've opened doors for others who have been able to come to the site, work at the site, and advance their careers and deepen their understanding and appreciation for African history. And we've also have, through our discoveries, been able to, we're in a position now to rewrite the history of the 25th dynasty, the late period in Egyptian history. We have we held 2 conferences in Luxor, Egypt over the past 4 years, in which we brought together other 25th dynasty scholars who work in isolation and shared publicly their discoveries of 25th dynasty tombs. And what we now know is that the 25th dynasty was responsible for creating many of the discoveries that have been attributed to the 26 dynasties. And for more specifically, what I also know is that the first pylon at Karnak Temple, the largest temple complex in the world, was built during the 25th dynasty. What we also know, information that is not available to the general public, is that Taharqa and Shabaka, 2 25th dynasty kings, were responsible for building more chapels and temples in Karnak Temple than any other king in Kemetic history. So we have been able to bring to light this unwritten story about the 25th dynasty. And in the process of doing that, we're giving life to our ancestors and allowing them to live through our work and our discoveries. And then there's another major discovery, which I'll share with the group tomorrow at my lecture, a discovery that I made last September while we were in Egypt, commemorating the opening of the restored second pillared hall in the priest of Karakorum that led to a major discovery that will allow us to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Africans from the Nile Valley are directly related to Africans from the Niger River Valley, and that they shared their technology, and that information, aspects of that same information now resides in the United States of America. So,
in the United States as opposed to further south?
Yes, in the United States. That's not, I'm not discounting Van Sertima's work, but I'll share this with you, and I'll show the audience tomorrow. I found painted on the ceiling of 2 25th dynasty tombs the Sankofa symbol. Okay. The Sankofa symbol. There are at least maybe 100 of those symbols painted on 2 tombs, 2 25th dynasty tombs. And so I'm now doing research on the presence of Nile Valley symbolism and culture in Ghana, Mali, and Nigeria. I've got a couple of books, and I'm seeking to make contact with residents in those countries who have said, whose ancestors say that they came there from the Nile Valley. So I want to begin to document these stories, these oral traditions and other traditions, and build a bridge of knowledge that will connect the Nile Valley with the Niger Valley.
Do you have any sense of the Sahara, now a desolate, but once a flourishing area? Do you have any sense of how that dead story, now sad, fits in and connects up those 2 regions? Yeah,
a good book that documents some of that is Robert Ball and Thomas Brophy's book, Black Genesis, which they talk about the desertification of the Sahara. And that prior to that period of time, that area was savanna. That area experienced a rainy season. And that was a period of migration, annual migrations of people from the west to the east. And the story that Black Genesis unveils is that it was people traveling from Chad into the Nile River Valley that were responsible for moving large blocks of stone. And there's evidence of that in southwest Egyptian desert. That is evidence that has just come to light. And then these people disappeared, and shortly after their disappearance, civilization was jump-started in the Nile River Valley. So there's much new evidence now that is revealing itself that requires thorough investigation so that we can deepen our understanding of the past. So we're doing that. And other opportunities have been created for us to begin to investigate specific aspects of African history that Europeans have been sitting on for decades.
Now, back to, in a way, the African presence in the Americas maybe has three periods: one before Columbus, and two after Columbus, the enslavement-related one, and the one that's now developing with Africans from the continent coming in droves, as it were, into the United States of America. Could you just talk a little bit about that first presence?
Sure.
And what in your work, and in that connection I mentioned, viewers can see it, your very wide-ranging and well-informed Nile Valley contribution to civilization. So what in that book, or has developed since, do you make, for example, the Olmec?
Right. Well, hand me the book for a
yes,
second.
absolutely.
I want to read a little bit. It's mine. I want to read this quote from the museum in Jalapa, Mexico. I was fortunate to have traveled to Mexico with Van Sertima on 2 trips into the Olmec region. And we visited all of the major sites. We visited a number of the museums. A very special visit we had with Van Sertima was to the home of his colleague, Dr. Alexander von Woodville, who was a German archaeologist.
Unexpected faces in New York.
Exactly. Who had one of the largest collection of terracotta heads, Kushite terracotta heads in Mexico. So we had a chance to visit with him on 2 occasions.
I didn't know that those two knew each other.
Oh yeah,
yes.
oh yeah,
great.
Yeah. And so when we went to the museum in Jalapa, the museum of Jalapa has the largest collection of Olmec heads, and there's a sign. As a matter of fact, another interesting collection is the architect who designed the museum in Jalapa, Mexico, also designed the Nubia Museum in Aswan. And there's a sign carved into the lintel at the entrance to this museum in Jalapa, and it says, let me read this for you. It says, "Attention Mexicans, this is the root of your history, its cradle and its altar. Listen to the most silent voices of the most ancient culture in Mexico, the mother of the civilization of our continent. The Olmecs, the Africans, the Kushites, the 25th dynasty, converted rain into harvest, the sun into a calendar, stone into sculpture, cotton into cloth, pilgrimage into commerce, mountains into thrones, jaguars into religion, and men into gods." So these are the Africans who brought culture to their land. These are the indigenous people of Mexico acknowledging the African contributions to civilization.
And again, further north, I see, if I'm not mistaken, that you've done some work on the connection between African, particularly ancient Kemetic symbolism and Washington. Right. Could you just say something about that?
Yeah, that is a publication that I did in 2005 entitled Egypt on the Potomac. And Egypt on the Potomac is a field trip that I created 31 years ago after my second trip to Egypt. 1985, I made my second trip to Egypt, and upon returning to D.C., I was amazed to realize now that D.C., my home at that time for the last 14 years, I noticed in D.C. architectural structures that were identical to structures that I had just seen in Egypt. And I knew that that wasn't an accident. So I began researching the history of the layout, design, and development in Washington, D.C. And what I was able to document in that field trip and in the book, Egypt on the Potomac, was that America's founding fathers in establishing the United States of America, and more specifically, the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C., the first planned capital built in the modern era. They literally drew inspiration for this capital from ancient Egypt, from the Nile Valley. Many of the founding fathers of America happen to be practicing Masons. And Masons trace their origins back to the Nile River Valley, specifically during the reign of Ramesses II. And so what I was now able to document was the effort on the part of white people to recreate Kemet on the Potomac River. And so the Washington Monument, which is an American statue, monument that everybody can relate to, is a copy of a monument that was dedicated in honor of Assad, the first king of Kemet, the first person in recorded history who died and was resurrected. And that I was also able to find, I was also able to prove that inside of that monument, which was completed in 1884, there was a dedication of that monument by the Masons from the same Masonic Lodge, Alexandria Lodge, that George Washington was a member of. And that structure was not dedicated to George, first president of the United States. It was actually dedicated to Assad, first king of Kemet. And there's a symbol inside of that monument that proves it. So it represents what I refer to as secrets hidden in plain sight. And the concept behind secrets hidden in plain sight is very simple, very basic. What better way to hide a secret than to put it in the open where everybody can see it? But all you need to do is to separate people from their ability to understand what they see.
Right,
so what Egypt on the Potomac does is takes you throughout the city, showing you specific landmarks that originated in Kemet, that were recreated in Washington, D.C., the capital of the wealthiest, most powerful nation in human history, in an attempt by Europeans to access the ancestral wisdom of Africa so that they could amass power. So my contention is, if this knowledge, this power was good enough for Europeans to use to lift themselves up, then why should people of African ancestry not use the same power to lift ourselves up? So once you know it's there, once you know its true meaning, then all you have to do...
To what extent, though, did they, as in the European founding fathers of the United States, really use, as opposed to display in plain sight, hidden at the same time, that point? To what extent? But it seems to me that they use a much more brutal mode of power as they expand across the continent, as they expand across the world.
Sure.
And there's no spirituality to their power that I detect. Certainly no African spirituality.
All right, well, let's look at it this way. Power doesn't discriminate. Power can be used for good or bad.
Yes.
And so it's the intent of the individual who uses the power that determines whether or not that power will be used for good or bad. So we know that any time a people steal another people, enslave and rape another people, that those are soulless creatures. So whatever soulless people do will also be soulless. We know that. They can take something good and by internalizing it within their soulless selves, it's going to lose its soul. But that doesn't diminish the power associated with that. So if we look at, and this is one of the things that I talked about in my first book, From the Browder File, if we look at the symbols on the back of the dollar bill, money runs the world. Money runs the world. And on the $1 bill, you have on the reverse of the $1 bill, Kemetic symbols, African symbols. What the hell is the pyramid doing on the back of the dollar bill? The people responsible for establishing the United States of America came from England. Are there any pyramids in England?
No, absolutely not. Right. So I think we're in agreement that the symbolism is there,
right?
And that it's a reach, a stretch out towards African power. And to repeat my little question, it's really to do with the fact that when we see them in operation, the righteous African symbolism is there, but the reality is a very different mode of power that really has absolutely nothing to do with Africa. It's to do with the evil nature of the people who have taken over the symbolism.
Well, not only the symbolism, because the symbolism is representative of the spirit and the power of the people, right?
Yes.
So,
but us in the Nile Valley, not them.
But again, the knowledge doesn't discriminate. It can be used. The knowledge can be used by a good man, a righteous man, to bring goodness to his people. The knowledge can be used by an evil man, a wicked man, to bring power to his people as well. Right? So again, the power doesn't discriminate, but the key is the symbolism is the key for us, because it's African symbolism, but we never knew it was African. We have been trained, we've been miseducated to believe that Egypt was white, that the pyramids were built by white people, that all of this was white history. But now that we know it's African history, we now can look beyond the veil and see the things that white folk put up on a pedestal as being things that are ours. And so we can now view how they distorted African history from a different perspective. And if we have the right consciousness, we now can see the good and the evil representation and extract the good out of that, because the good is still there. Right? So in terms of what I mentioned previously about the knowledge of the Nile River Valley was taken to the Niger River Valley and now resides in the Potomac and Mississippi River Valley, I'm of the mindset to embrace the possibility that our ancestors in the Nile Valley knew that Kemet was going to fall. And that they knew that the knowledge that was there was too important, certain knowledge was too important to allow to fall into the hands of the evil, wicked men who were coming. And that they decided to dispatch some of that knowledge, to break it up and dispatch that knowledge to the West. Piece of it went to Nigeria and influenced the Akan people. To Ghana and influenced the Akan people. Another piece went to Nigeria and influenced the Yoruba. And the last piece of this knowledge, the last migration out of the Nile Valley, there were 6. The last migration went into Mali and influenced the Dogon. So if our ancestors had the foresight to know that Kemet was going to fall, and they sent that knowledge west, then they had to have known that West Africa was going to fall. And that knowledge, along with those West Africans, were going to be taken further west into the Americas, where even though Africans would be enslaved, Africans would be denied everything that came to represent their humanness. Then, and maybe I'm stretching, if I am, I'm sure you'll let me know. Our ancestors had to know. Our ancestors had to know that at some point those Africans in the Americas would begin to rise up. So we Africans in America are now the wealthiest and best educated African people on the planet. We are the linchpin to the liberation of Africa. And we now have access. We now have access. Believe me, we now have, some of us, let's put it that way, some of us have access to knowledge that I firmly feel our ancestors made sure was in America at this particular point in time in history. So we now can access it with our minds intact, interpret that information correctly, and now use that information to kickstart a new transformation of consciousness.
One or two little caveats, if you will.
Of course.
But Harif stuff. And I know that since the international economic crisis of, say, since 2007, that
2008.
7,
Yeah.
8,
7,
whatever.
8.
Yeah, you know.
They acknowledged it in 2008, right? Yeah.
That crisis has had a catastrophic impact on African Americans.
For sure.
Their net wealth has fallen catastrophically.
Yep.
And so I'm not sure to what extent the proposition you just advanced about wealth recognizes that, one. And then the other problem is that whether African knowledge and African American money can really be what saves continental Africa, not from an absence of knowledge, but from the domination that has been instituted within Africa, within the framework of neocolonialism, and which faces Africa with what looks to me like a worsening situation. So,
okay, appreciate that. And so I want to move beyond philosophical and historical to practical.
Yes.
Right? You're absolutely right. The financial crisis that led to the election of Barack Hussein Obama was orchestrated, right? Orchestrated, and that the African American community suffered disproportionately to every community. And what that has done for the African Americans who thought they had it made and now realize that they're suffering just like the rest of them, that has caused many of them to wake up. And many of them now are reading and want to learn about this African stuff that they didn't want to hear about before. So we now have a growing interest in all things African. We're now witnessing another renaissance like the Afrocentric movement in the 1990s. I'm seeing it right now. All right? I'm seeing it right now. And the other thing is, while there were many African Americans who lost a fortune, those African Americans were not investing in African people in the first place, right? But I can also say this, that since 2008, with the creation of the Asa Restoration Project, that project has been funded primarily by African American dollars. The African American community has invested over 3 million Egyptian pounds in that project. And their investment in this project has allowed us to uncover the things that we have uncovered. So in the midst of this financial disaster, it has created a wonderful opportunity for us to get access to our historical information that's allowing us to create a new future. So within every disaster, there will be opportunities for those who are positioned properly to take advantage of. And I don't believe these things happen by accident. I don't believe these things happen by coincidence. There is no such thing as chance, coincidence, or accident in the universe ruled by law and divine order. Everything happens for a reason. And that there are people with whom, through whom the ancestors will work through to make sure that they're divinely positioned, to make sure that specific things happen exactly when they're supposed to happen.
Apart from your...
Can I get an amen on that? Now, don't just over that.
No.
You asked me a question and I think I responded to your question.
I'm not missing your answer. I'm about to say that apart from what I asked, apart from that wonderful and positive story of African American investment in the recovery of Egyptian knowledge.
African knowledge.
Yeah, African Egyptian knowledge. Yes.
Well, it's not just because look, if we follow this concept of this vibration, it's not just Egyptian knowledge. It's African knowledge.
I'm with you.
It's African knowledge. So
African country is one and indivisible. Okay. So we're not in disagreement about it.
Okay.
My little question really is, apart from that, and I do not deny its importance or its reality, but what other positives do we now look for or at in terms of developments in continental Africa and in the connection between continental Africa and the African American part of the Western diaspora?
Well, what I know is that in the 1960s, 1960s, at the height of our civil rights movement, when African Americans began to throw off the name Negro and began to embrace themselves as black people and African people, when they began to get rid of the processed hair, began wearing naturals, when they began to wear African clothing and take on African names, it was that movement that prompted Africans in the Caribbean and Africans on the continent to begin to see themselves as Africans. As Africans, right? So we know that because of the fact that America is the wealthiest, most powerful nation on the face of this planet, that American media saturates the world. And the images of African Americans shape and influences people all over the world. So to the extent to which African Americans can begin to take more control over our images, is the extent to which we can influence people all over the world. To the extent to which we begin to educate ourselves and steep ourselves into the recovery of African history, is the extent to which we make that process popular all over the world. And as a result of my travels to Africa and knowing many of the African-centered scholars in the States who travel frequently to Africa, they have shared with me on many occasions that continental Africans, many of the continental Africans, specifically in West Africa, say that if Africa is going to be saved, it's going to be saved by African Americans who have a greater interest in African culture and African spirituality than many continental Africans. You have many Africans, let's just use Ghana for an example. You have a proliferation of Christianity. Christian churches. The largest church in Accra is Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Right? So the missionaries are coming back into Africa again because they know what Africans in the diaspora are doing. They know that if we ever regain our consciousness, that there will not be a place for them in Africa. So they have to make this mad dash to come in and reinstitute Christianity in Africa. And they're doing that. And they're very successful.
Recolonize the mind.
Recolonize the mind. Or in teaching Africans to hate their own cultural traditions and embrace the image of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white man and believe that that is their savior. So, you know, the mere fact that the Europeans have been forced to up their game in a direct response of Africans reclaiming their African traditions means that we're on the right path. So we may be losing certain religious battles in the continent right now, but the war is advancing. Yeah. And in the long term, I feel very strongly we're going to be victors in this war because of what we're currently witnessing right now in the United States and in England and in the EU. We're starting to see this European conglomeration break up. We're starting to see that. And when it breaks up, as I mentioned earlier, that's going to give Africans an opportunity now to begin to reassert ourselves. We can take advantage of the climate of confusion that's being created right now. So we have to be strategic. Yeah. And we have to commit ourselves to a long-term strategy that will extend far beyond our own lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we can or should ignore the disaster that is, for example, the AU and the nonsense that is characteristically taking place on continental Africa. What should we make of that?
Well, look. If we understand...
And inside of that, increasing American military presence inside of something called AFRICOM, where they have alliances with 20 odd at least African nation states.
What we are witnessing is the last effort on the part of a colonial mindset that they have for the last 500 years. They've been doing everything within their power to destroy Africa and African people. Right? And I know in the study of history that is what they are meant to do. That's the only thing that they can do. They did not come to save Africa. Right? And they are reaching the end of their rope. Everything has a beginning and an end. So their period of domination is coming to an end. Anyone who is grounded in the sense of history can see the end coming. And so the question then for us becomes, what will we do when the period of European domination ends? Right? One of the things that has often happened is that when European domination ends, the Africans who step in to fill that void are more European mentally than the Europeans.
That's what neocolonialism is. All right.
So that means then that this is also an excellent opportunity for us to begin to engage in acts of Sankofa. To be able to find the best of African history and culture and spirituality, and to begin to introduce these concepts and to use the technology that we have available to us to begin to proliferate this information, not among the old folk, because the old folk are going to be gone in another 20 or 30 years, but then the young people. And so it's about using some of the same strategies, but using them for correct purposes to shape the minds of the generations that haven't been born. And to begin to develop a curriculum, spiritual traditions, educational traditions, and media content to begin to reach the next 3 generations of African people and give them a perception of themselves that they've never had before. Make them feel proud to be African. Make them feel proud to follow the traditions of their great-great-great-great-grandparents. Help them understand how Europeans came in and colonized their mind and made everything African negative. We are in a perfect position now to reverse that trend. And so it's going to take forward thinking and at least a 150-year plan to begin to implement this change and to commit ourselves to ensure that that change takes place and continues to unfold over the course of the next 150 years. If we don't start thinking at least 150 years into the future, we might as well grow up and play dead.
Yes. I think Mr. Garvey had an idea along very much those lines. Let me ask you, in closing, about two big entities that are problematic in relation to Africa after we've left the declining white man to one side. And that's the Arab Islam, that force, and secondly China. Where are they in your perspective of African taking advantage of what you see as an advantageous moment?
Right. Well, the reality is, brother, someone can only take advantage of you to the extent to which you allow them to
I
take
agree with
advantage.
that, yes.
And if Africans knew who they were, if Africans took pride in what their ancestors had created, then they would make the environment inhospitable for Arabs or Chinese. And I just want to go with something real simple, real basic. If African women love themselves as African women and stop buying fake hair, if African women love themselves as African women and stop patronizing these beauty stores, these cosmetic environments that supposedly will make them beautiful, if they understood that they were born beautiful, and they didn't have
all run by Indians here.
Indians or Koreans. I mean, I was walking down the street today in I think it was Edmonton, wherever my hotel was, and saw nail shops. And nail shops, they were run by Koreans, just like the nail shops are back in the States. I saw shops where they're selling fake hair. Right? So we can start with something simple. I mean, forget the Chinese for a minute, forget the Arabs for a minute. Let's focus on ourselves. If we can get our women to embrace the fact that African hair is beautiful hair, like we did in the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, when sisters wore afros in the 60s, it was symbolic of a revolutionized mind.
Transformation.
Right? Yeah. So, in one of my essays in my first book from the Browder Father, Politics of Hair, I stated back in 1989 that you can always tell the consciousness and the destiny of a people by how they wear their hair.
Yes. I read that this morning.
Right? So if we can get mothers to stop pressing their hair and stop pressing their daughters' hair. If we can get them to stop putting fake nails and understand the beauty and love the beauty that they inherited, the beauty that is in their DNA right now, that will change everything. So when we do that, our homes will be inhospitable to Arabs, Chinese, and Europeans. And that's something that we have control over. So I'm always an advocate of us exercising personal responsibility. And if we take care of ourselves and strengthen ourselves such that we can't be exploited by outsiders, then they will go someplace else to exploit another foolish people.
Yes. I mentioned Garvey in connection with your perspective, and I think there is a correspondence. Garvey's project about self-hate and self-love as the answer to that. Massive mutual cooperation as the answer to racial solidarity, racial potentializing, if you will. But there's another dimension to Garvey, the strictly big political one, where he focused on the need to end colonialism. And there's a real problem with that, because his project is successful and the colonialists go, and then they leave in place a generation of neocolonials who, in the context of the Cold War, they support very brutally, and we're still in that moment. And I just wonder if your theory embraces that political dimension as well, because there's a big problem with neocolonialism, with the extent to which our current rulers have embraced, permitted almost all of what is happening to us. The whites don't even have to use military force anymore, because in the 80s,
Sure.
our leaders signed up to all kinds of stuff that ruining our economies and so on and so forth. And I just wonder where that dimension of it is in your approach.
Sure. Well, you know, I think one of the key words that you used was our rulers. They're not our rulers. They're not our rulers if we didn't elect them, if we can't protect them. They're not our rulers. Huh?
We don't want to protect them.
Well, we didn't put them in place. They're protected by the Europeans.
Absolutely.
So,
yes.
so you know, one of the key things that we have to be willing to do, and I think again it's very basic, and it goes back to two things I want to share with you in closing that Dr. Clark talked about, that spoke to this issue. Dr. Clark was a Pan-Africanist from the heart, from the soul.
Absolutely.
And he said that if all the Europeans were to leave Africa today, and Africans were standing at the threshold of assuming their own leadership over their destiny, he said what will happen based on colonization is that we would stand at the threshold and get into an argument as to whether or not we want to cross that threshold without that's what our right. So it's the colonization of the mind.
Yes,
Get back
yes.
to. And one of the major tools in the colonization of the mind is the colonization of people's concept of God. Anytime you envision a creator who doesn't look like you, you're going to be in trouble. I don't care who your leadership is. So if you can begin by raising several generations to understand that God is a man-made concept, and that every indigenous people view God, view the Creator as looking like them. Every successful people see themselves in the image of God. So it's about engaging in an act of Sankofa and pulling back those images and those texts that glorify a Creator who mirrors us.
Yeah.
Right? And to understand that we are here as co-creators. We are here to create. We are here to create. We have the option of either creating heaven on earth or hell on earth. And it's what we do that determines the outcome. And through a process, a mass process of socialization, not unlike what Mao Zedong did or what Fidel Castro did.
Yes.
I mean, you throw out the oppressor, but you also have to throw out the oppressor's mindset, consciousness, and then find the best of your own cultural consciousness, and then bring together groups of artists who can now create media content, plays and songs and books that glorify your ancestors. That is what will ensure that whatever leadership you select will be a leadership that's steeped in perpetuating the best of their people. And that is a leadership that won't betray you. And if you see that leadership does betray you, then there has to be another segment of the society whose job it is to take out their leadership.
Yes. That's a good place to end. And may I say, I love your mention of China and Cuba, because what happened in both of those places, and what is happening in there now, followed a very deep revolution where they broke with Western power and gave themselves the possibility to do what they're presently doing. And one of the problems with continental Africa is that there was, in fact, no African revolution, and we still have to make it. Thank you.
Thank you.